I have one final quote that I believe firmly establishes the overarching problem. This one is from Generic Processes in the Reproduction of Inequality. In this particular context, they were discussing rapists and the supposed logic behind why they committed an act of sexual assault. A second point is that the rapist's excuses and justifications are commonplace, familiar to any adult raised in US culture. We see these accounts as elements of a wider sexist discourse that, on the one hand, devalues women's subjectivity and at the same time conditions men's subjectivity in a way that diminishes empathy with women, and thus facilitates action that perpetuates male supremacy. This idea of a sexist discourse that devalues women's subjectivity and conditions men's subjectivity to diminish empathy with women is a foundational problem behind everything going on in gaming culture. Women's perspectives are seen as not mattering, and because of this, women who participate in the culture have to deal with, at best, being excluded and mocked and derided, and at worst, threatened with rape and death, and forced to undergo waves of severe harassment. To men, games are just games. To some men, even the game of terrorizing feminist critics is just a game. These issues stem from the fundamental distancing and othering of femininity within our overall culture, but especially within the subculture of gaming. As long as we continue to privilege men in our interactions with gaming and other gaming fans, we continue to alienate men from women, which leads to severe consequences for women. I hope my overarching hypothesis and the various points contained within it have been compelling in some way, because I'm coming at this from both an academic and a personal perspective, as someone who does care a lot about video games as an art form, but has to often contend with the disheartening level of cultural issues that go on within gaming. My goal with this video is to try to identify what I think are some of the big problems in gaming culture, and also what to do about them. I'd like to finish this video off by talking about what I think should be done. On the industry level, I think we need more women in games, and I think we need a more diverse group of people in charge of what kinds of games see release. Granted, the indie game market has allowed for alternatives, but this alone can't fix the issue of male dominance, because AAA gaming still has the most control over how games and gaming as a culture is perceived. Allowing ourselves to explore genres with bigger budgets that are not inherently masculinized, and allowing women and other marginalized groups to be involved in the creation process with a lot of say in the final product would be a way of combating the issue. We have seen the occasional example of this, with Minecraft and Portal being two examples that have been highly successful without necessarily needing to appeal to a masculine ideal. We don't need to get rid of hypermasculine violence fests, so much as reduce their value in determining where the money and talent in gaming goes towards, so that we can see more options available to gamers who are disinterested in such things. The industry also has to take measures to prevent harassment both online in their games and in other forms such as the harassment of employed women by gamers with an axe to grind. On a cultural level, we need to continue with feminist critiques of games, and we need to recognize how dominated by men the culture of gaming is, because if we don't consider the possibility that we're thinking on male-centric terms, we risk running into issues of discourse such as the dichotomy between true gamers and casuals, as well as the issue of objectivity as the only meaningful source of recognizing value in a work of art. We need to learn to value the differences in perspective and experience that allows us to see outside of rigidly defined standards for games, so that way games are allowed the opportunity to explore ideas beyond shoot or be shot and punch or be punched. And when it comes to the games themselves, we do need to stop framing games from the male gaze's perspective, where women are portrayed as sex objects. It may seem apolitical, but it has ramifications that are measurably negative for both men and women, so there needs to be a way of exploring femininity and sexuality without creating women as inherently tied to men's perception of our bodies. That requires more women in video games, more positively portrayed women in games, more playable women in games, and more feminine perspectives in games. These need to not just become increasingly common, they need to become part of the norm. We need games like Depression Quest to coexist with games like Grand Theft Auto without being squashed by gamers or by the industry. Furthermore, we need games that aren't combat-oriented or hyper-violent to have more mainstream success, get more coverage, and garner a bigger audience. The issues of gaming culture are the issues of culture itself, issues of dominance, control, power, and privilege. Future conversations need to be had about other ways in which gaming fans, game developers, and game themselves help to maintain and enact norms that can be harmful. More research into women's issues in the workplace of game developers would also be important. Where we sit in relation to these issues will vary from person to person, but all of us who enter in as a participant of the subculture have some effect in both reproducing and subverting these qualities. We have to recognize our own part and make changes whenever we can, but we also have to recognize when we're doing something right, as well as when developers and games are doing things right. Anita Sarkeesian may have had a very basic approach to feminist analysis of games, but she was definitely at a good starting point for how we discussed the topic. The extreme levels of hate she received only shows that even the starting point itself has a lot more barriers to entry than most people could even fathom. I hope in this video I was able to outline some potential starting points for future endeavors. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank, once again, my professor for helping me with getting a hold of a lot of the citations that I used for this video. I'd like to thank my school and the library for allowing me to use their scanner for a very long time. I'd like to thank my mom for answering questions related to her experiences playing games and also just for being the best mom in the world. I'd like to thank everyone who answered my survey because your insight helped to really get the ball rolling on this video. I'd like to thank Noah Gervais, Dan Olson, Ian Danskin, and Shaun the Skull Guy for serving as good references for Gamergate and the alt-right movement. I'd like to thank, in particular, Chris Franklin for giving me permission to use pieces of his video in Part 5. I'd like to thank all of the authors and organizations involved in the citations that I pulled from, which will of course be cited in the description for all of these videos. Lastly, I'd like to thank my viewers, in particular those who follow me on Twitter or donate to me on Patreon. I make these videos because I have something to say, and knowing that others are listening always warms my heart. Of course, I have a Patreon, and if you feel like this content or any of my other videos are something you would like to support, then feel free to pledge, though you can also feel free not to pledge. It won't bother me one bit. I intend to use all Patreon money to help fund college expenses, which includes tuition. I have plans to get into the field of sociology as a professional someday, so if you feel that my content is worthwhile and you want to help support that endeavor, all generosity is appreciated no matter the amount. Again, thanks for watching and see you in the comments.